social phenotypes evolve according to rules that are somewhat different from those for other non-social phenotypes. And in this lecture and chapter in the textbook, we'll consider the outlines of the key principle, which is that of inclusive fitness. It's best illustrated with social insects in the Hymenoptera, in particular ants, for reasons that you'll see by the end of the lecture. These worker leafcutter ants are sterile, as you probably know. They're sterile females. They differ greatly from queens and males, the reproductives of their species. Darwin, a great naturalist, knew well about the lives of social insects, and he was hugely troubled by the existence of social insect workers because they have no fitness. And in a famous passage in The Origin, he says, I'm going to focus now on this difficulty, which at first seemed to me fatal to my entire theory. He meant the theory of natural selection. How can they evolve? If Darwin had known about genes, he would have figured it out. The key is that individuals, we now understand more clearly with genetics than Darwin could intuit without genetics. Individuals can have indirect or vicarious reproductive success through close genetic relatives. And Darwin did intuit the outlines of that explanation, even though he couldn't explicitly justify it. Later in the 20th century, what we now call the theory of kin selection was worked out by R.A. Fisher, who invented quantitative genetics and the analysis of variants, J.B.S. Haldane, who we met briefly when we discussed rates of contemporary evolution, and especially by William Hamilton, known as W.D. Hamilton. All three of them Brits, as it happens. Behavior can be said to be social in this technical sense when it affects the fitnesses of other individuals. That is to say, a social phenotype is one that has fitness effects not just on the individual that expresses the phenotype, but on other individuals around that one. So it follows, and in fact Hamilton was the first to point this out in this form, that there's a 2x2 classification of social phenotypes or acts that follows directly from that observation. We can classify by the effect that the act has on the fitness of the recipient, the other individual or individuals affected by it, as well as the effect the act has on the fitness of the actor, the one expressing the phenotype, which is all we've been thinking about up to this point in the course. And so those effects, of course, can be either plus or minus. If you do something that helps your own fitness, that's a plus. Then the question is, what's it do to the fitness of the individual that you're interacting with, say, your little brother or sister? Well, it could be a negative effect, in which case we would classify the act as selfish from the point of view of the actor. I help my fitness and hurt yours. Or it could be classified as cooperative if it helps my fitness and it helps yours, which is, of course, very nice whenever we can do that. And so both of these kinds of acts are relatively easy to explain. They do not give rise to the crisis of faith that bothered Darwin back when he was writing The Origin. It's these ones where the effect of the act on the fitness of the actor is negative. If it's negative, that is to say, lose-lose for the two of us. Yeah, I hurt you, but I also hurt myself in the process. That we naturally call spite. That has always seemed and remains very hard to explain. except under specialized kinds of circumstances. But the other really important box in the 2x2 is this one, altruism, where I do something that hurts me in the sense of diminishing my fitness, but it helps you. It increases your fitness. Both of these, as I said, are hard to explain. We don't see what looks like spite very often in the world, so it's not a big problem, but this one is. There is altruism. Darwin knew about it. Families do it all the time. Without the theory of inclusive fitness, it's really a puzzle. So we've already hinted at the solution. It's that if the affected individuals, both recipients of the recipients of the behavior, are relatives of the actor, that is, if both the actor and recipient are relatives, then selection, it turns out, can favor altruism itself, this lower right-hand box, the lose-win corner, and it can also favor restraint from selfishness. That is, it can limit the upper left-hand corner, which on the face of it is easy to explain, but actually becomes harder to explain in closely related social circumstances. So that's what we're now going to walk through, is the argument behind this and some of the evidence that supports at least the basic outlines of the theory. And why does it work? Well, you probably know this already or see it coming. It's that relatives tend to carry and hence transmit on their own copies of the actor's own genes, including any that might have the effect of inducing the altruism or the restraint from selfishness. So that provides in outline an explanation. Hamilton's great contribution to this subject was defining the inclusive fitness effect of a behavior as its effect on the fitness of the actor, that's this here, plus or minus, and by how much, and also on the fitness of the recipients, devalued by the coefficients of relationship to the actor. So this is a quantitative condition. That is to say, the prediction is that natural selection favors behaviors, that is, phenotypes, that tend to increase the inclusive fitness of the actor when we take into account both the effect of the act, that is, the phenotype, on the fitness of the actor and its fitness on the recipient or recipients devalued by the relevant coefficients of relationship. Hamilton showed in a brilliant pair of papers in 1964 that in a straightforward mathematical model of natural selection, an extension of the selection model we've been working with this semester, that indeed alleles that promoted inclusive fitness, that increase it at all in this sense, would tend to increase under the force of selection relative to those that don't satisfy that criterion. So the conditions for altruism or restraint from selfishness are clearly going to depend on this number called the coefficient of relatedness, little r, between actor and recipient. It's most generally defined as a correlation or regression between the recipient's genotype and the actor's genotype, which is a bit abstract, although it's easy to understand once you understand it. It can also be calculated more simply, and I hope for most of you this will be a little more intuitive, as the probability that an allele in the actor is found identical by recent descent in the recipient. And from that definition, we'll develop a kind of equivalence principle that makes reasonable sense intuitively. So here's how it goes. You need a relatedness diagram to make these quantitative arguments. So here's the actor, and this, by the way, is from the chapter in Heron and Freeman. So here's the actor with an X to indicate where this is the focal individual, it and the potential recipient of an act are half sibs. They have one shared parent. So if we take these probabilities, which you've met before, perhaps in the context of inbreeding arguments, there's a half chance I got any given allele from our shared parent, in which case, if I did, there's a half chance that that parent passed it on to this recipient, my half sib, and so that argument gets us a relatedness of a quarter, which is the standard relatedness coefficient to a half sib. If we're full sibs, we have that effect independently through both parents, so we get a quarter plus a quarter, which is to say a half, which is the meaning behind I share half my genes, quote unquote, with my full sib. And for a first cousin, same idea. If I'm the actor, my parent and your parent are full sibs, let's say, so they're related by a half. I'm related by a half to my parent, and then if she or he had the gene, there's a half chance it was an auntie or uncle who had a half chance of passing it down to you. We get R equals an eighth. So the intuitive understanding of why these dictate the conditions under which altruism might be profitable in an evolutionary sense is that you can view R as the degree to which another individual's reproduction is genetically equivalent to mine. So I actually have a full sister. She has two daughters, my nieces. Okay, I'm related to them by, you all know the answer, by a quarter. I would have been related to my own kids had I had them by a half. Okay, so my nieces are genetically half as quote unquote good in this sense as my own kids would have been. All right, so that says, one offspring, okay, two nephews or nieces. It's a wash. Am I doing that right? Yes, I am doing that right. That's right. My sister's offspring are half as closely related to me as my own offspring would be. So in that sense, each one of them is like having half an offspring. So that if I can do something to increase my siblings' reproduction by one offspring, it's equivalent to having increased my own reproduction by half an offspring. Okay, and so that right away implies what the conditions for performing altruism or for restraining from selfishness might be. It's going to depend on the costs and the benefits to the actor and the recipient, which is also part of what Hamilton clarified when he established the theory of inclusive fitness, which is very careful rules about how we're to define these costs and benefits. So for altruism, the benefit to the recipient is the increase in fitness of the recipient caused by the act. As I just said about my sister, hypothetically, right, if I could have done something to cause her to have another offspring more than she would have, that would have been a benefit of, say, one offspring to her. Then the question is, what was the cost to the actor, me in this case, for doing it? What decrease in fitness was caused to me by myself by performing this altruistic act? Hamilton's rule for the evolution, that is for the performance of an act of pure altruism in that situation, is therefore that B times R, that is the benefit to the recipient, say my sister, times R, my relatedness to her, has to be greater than C. Okay, so the R is a number less than 1, right? It's a half in the case of full siblings. So the benefit to my sister would have to be a little more than twice the cost to me for that act to be favored by natural selection under the terms of this theoretical model. Conversely, for restraint from selfishness, B is going to be the benefit to the actor. Selfishness, remember, is something that helps the actor's fitness but hurts the recipient's fitness. C then will be a cost to the recipient, again in offspring gained or foregone. And so Hamilton's rule for restraint from selfishness is that the benefit to the actor of being selfish must be less than the cost to the recipient devalued by the actor's relatedness to the recipient. Okay, so for altruism in any case, the ground rules are pretty clear. We should see more of it in situations where individuals are apparently helping their close relatives at a cost to themselves. And famous examples include warning calls to neighbors, which many rodents especially and birds engage in, when a predatory mammal or bird is lurking in the neighborhood and potentially threatening the social group. So Belding's ground squirrels were studied by Paul Sherman and others a long time ago when this thinking was all new, and they asked who are the callers, right? When do they call? They first established that indeed it is dangerous to be making these warning calls. The caller is more likely to be killed by the predator than a non-caller. And in Belding's ground squirrel, anyway, where Sherman and friends studied them, the callers were predominantly females. And it turns out females were more highly related to their neighbors than males because they tended to remain near their natal burrows, while males tended to disperse on approaching sexual maturity. So that's qualitatively supportive of the theory. John Hoagland and colleagues studied this in black-tailed prairie dogs, another small squirrel, and they give bark alarms, it turns out, more common when kin are near. And they did experimental tests by dragging a stuffed badger on a sled near these guys who were in a position to possibly call, and they did. And so the figure, again from Heron and Freeman, shows the percentage of simulated badger attacks in which prairie dogs gave alarm calls on the y-axis of these bar charts, and it shows males and females separately in two slices through the definition of potential beneficiaries of the alarm call. This is just without kin, the green bars, versus with kin in the home coterie, that is the social family group sharing, I guess, a network of burrows. And there was a significantly greater tendency, both for males and females, to call more. That is, they were more liable to call in the presence of the stuffed badger coming through on a sled when there were kin around than when there weren't. But it didn't make a difference whether they were with parents or full siblings, that is their own immediate nuclear family, or whether they were with offspring. In both cases, there was a slightly greater tendency to call when part of the group included offspring of the caller, but it wasn't statistically significant, so basically a wash. They also, very interestingly, had life cycle data on a number of males that they knew individually and followed, and they were able to make this remarkable graph that showed for each of these 5 or 6, however many it is, different males. Maybe it's just 4. Anyway, each of the colors is a different male for whom they had multiple observations at life stages from younger to older, from left to right. So this first is living in their birth coterie with parents, sibs, and other kin, and so they all had a probability of calling in response to the badger. When they moved out to a breeding coterie but had not yet sired pups, all of them were much less likely. Some of them never called in response to the badger when they were in this adopted family but hadn't yet been a father to anybody. But when they had offspring, all of them had the probability go up. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, no, there are 5 here, right? So there were 5 individuals had their probability go up. In some cases, 2 of them, 100% of the time, would call. Then there was one individual who later got evicted from his breeding coterie and was observed living in a situation with no kin nearby, and he still did call, but it looks like 30-40% of the time, but it was less than he had called when he was a breeder in the coterie, or when he was a young one at home with his original family. So here's a clicker question, conceptual. You can't really click, but you should be able to answer the question. What kind of act are alarm calls? Are they altruistic, cooperative, selfish, or spiteful? What is the cost to the caller derived from, mainly? Is it lost foraging time, lost metabolic energy, increased risk of predation, or can't you see I'm upset? And what are the benefits to the recipients? They don't have to stop foraging, they get a warning, or the predator is scared off, or thank you for sharing. Okay, last example comes from birds. These are white-fronted bee-eaters, a highly social bird species in Africa, I believe is where they live and were studied. And they have big communal groups of anywhere between 3 and 17 adults. In their ecology, there's a lot of nestling mortality, and larger groups do fledge more young through some combination, probably of feeding them better. So here's a juvenile bee-eater soliciting a feeding from an adult, and probably also by better protection of the nest from predators. So these are number of fledged babies, some kind of adjusted mean measure, as a function of the group size, anywhere from 2 to 6 adults, and there is a steady, significant monotonic increase in fledging success as a function of the group size. So naturally, the question is, who helps with this protection and feeding of the young? Individuals born in the group turn out to be more likely to help, as opposed to simply hanging out and enjoying the benefits of being in the group, than do individuals who entered the group from the outside. And individuals are more likely to help when they are, as a matter of fact, closely related to the nestlings. And the investigators followed this population long enough, got to know enough individuals that they could figure out, in many cases, how related a given helper was to the young ones it was helping to rear. And the long and short of it, again, from the textbook, so you can look up the details there if you're interested, were that the probability of helping was hugely greater for helpers that were born into the group, as opposed to those that were apparently unrelated in-laws coming in from the outside. And specifically, helping events were more likely than expected given the opportunity when the helper, or the potential helper, was related either as a full sib or a half sib to the targets of the help, and they were less likely to occur than expected based on opportunity when the helper was less likely, like first cousin relatedness or less. Okay, so let's stop there, and when we come back, talk about the most fascinating kind of prediction of this theory of inclusive fitness, which is that there will be some situations with irreconcilable conflicts of interest between different actors in the family group. So see you then.